Record, start video. I'm recording this, but the video is only facing this way. So let's start out today with a little bit of a recap. And this is like, let's see. This is like you can know stuff, you can not know stuff. It doesn't matter. Okay, but let's just figure out what we remember, even for the past couple weeks, about federalism. Federalism. Candice, what do you remember anything about federalism? Shay, can you help her out? Anything. That's okay. Well, I think once we dive into this, what do we think it refers to? Federalism. Federal government. Boom. Shay, apart from the federal government, who else makes laws? Tribes and or hours of it. States. All right. Fantastic. All right. So we got it. Like right in front of us. Oh yeah, there's state. Yeah, states. Okay. So we got feds, and then we got states. And the feds and states, or Josh, you can see this. The feds and states have not always gotten along. In fact, they don't get along these days all the time, right? You can think of some current issues where the federal government will do something, the state might not agree to it, right? And so there's always been this fight for power between states and the federal government. We remember back to a couple weeks ago, we were talking about the Articles of Confederacy when the United States was founded. And the Articles of Confederacy created a union of states, or a union of states, basically. And those states were very individual, separate governments. Okay, they were only united in this common cause of, at the beginning of getting rid of British rule, and then into forming their own government. And as they began to form their own government, and as the Articles of Confederacy gave way for the Articles in the Constitution, we began to see more of this unity between states. We, the people, right? This kind of combined sense of a nation, not just a collection of states, of a group of states that were working together. And so we went from having states which were their own separate governments in a confederacy. If you are, I don't know if it's Star Wars or Star Trek, but one of those is like has a confederacy, and it's basically like, I guess, all these planets and people who are their own people. Do you do Star Trek? Star Trek. Yeah, I have no. I feel like Star Wars might have something like that too, because they all have their own little planets and things. But so confederacy is very separate, and then we have something like our constitutional democracy in the United States, which is combining those separate federations almost and creating a stronger national government. So let's think, and we can think based on the Constitution articles, which we've looked over, but we can just think in our heads. What can the federal government do that states cannot? What can the federal government do that states cannot?
The only thing I can remember is wheat.
Oh, the wheat. Oh, good one. Good one. You're way advanced, man. We can even step it back. But so what does wheat have to do with again?
The commerce.
Commerce. Oh, commerce. That is like you skipped right to chapter 12 when Billy is about to drown and Sammy saves him. No, all right, we got to commerce. It's right, that's for the feds. And that's in the Constitution, right? The Commerce Clause is where that's at. We also have, we'll talk about some more later, the Dormant Commerce Clause. It basically says the states can't, the Commerce Clause says the federal government can regulate commerce. The Dormant Commerce Clause says states can't regulate commerce. Clause. It's not exactly written in the Constitution, but it's implied effectively. not really one of the implied powers as they call them, but it's implied by the fact that the Commerce Clause is written for the federal government only. But let's take some more, like, step back into just basics, day-to-day basics. What can the feds do to us that the states can't? What can the states do to us that the feds can't? See, if North Dakota wanted to make its own money, and called it the coin money. Coin money. Oh, look at that. Coin money. Even got the sort of phrasing right. Yeah. Coin money, right? So that's why I don't know if anyone's ever heard some of the people who talk about sovereignty for Standing Rock, and they talk about in order for Standing Rock to be its own independent nation, it needs to have its own money. Now, some of the ways people have suggested doing this is through like PKC money, like, or one of the casinos' money, basically like tokens or something. It's kind of an interesting idea. If that was, you go to any presentations on sovereignty or whatever, people are always talking about how one of the UN, United Nations focuses on determining if a country is its own country as opposed to being under another country is if that country has its own economic system, its own finances, and its own money. So when people talk about wanting to show the Standing Rock's independent nation by having its own language, having its own, XYZ telecom, propane, whatever, infrastructure grid, and then also having its own money. All right, so feds can coin money, feds control commerce, which is a huge one. Have you guys heard about this thing south of Texas, south of the southern states, but north of Mexico that is being built? A fence, wall, whatever, right? I don't know, did it get built all the way? I think it kind of went out of fashion. Yeah, and then there's like a tribe on there. I've been to that red. I can't remember, it's a long board. They said we're not gonna have it. All right, anyway, they tried to build a fence. That was the feds. Okay, the feds are responsible for all naturalization, so becoming a citizen. Okay, states can figure out their own citizenship within bounds, but they can't choose what makes somebody a citizen of the country or not. Naturalization, other things related to immigration, that's all in the federal domain. And that's not to say that there aren't pieces of that which states take up. For example, Bismarck or North Dakota has some refugee resettlement agencies that the state funds. So the state might be involved in that, but actually the granting of naturalization, as they call it, is in the federal domain. Let's say North Dakota gets really angry at Japan. Dun, 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 dun. And they say they can't declare war. They can't declare war. Look at that. You beat me at my own game. Candace was like, where is she going with this? What is going on? She's like, declare war. Declare war. Yes, declare war.
It's just one of those days.
Candace is like, why is North Dakota upset with Japan? Why North Dakota? I think they grow things in North Dakota that Japan buys, but I forget what it is. It's one of the crops. It's like a real big thing in Japan. It's worth more money in Japan. So they grow in North Dakota. Because it grows well here. Let's talk about things both the feds and the states make laws. Make laws. No, they totally can. So they can make laws. And what can they make laws about? To protect citizens. Yep. They can make. I understand what you're saying now. So they can do like a. Actually, we'll put it down there. So they can maybe, police powers, create sort of, yeah, police powers, it depends on what level of police powers. But you're right, they're, between the two of them, sorry, go ahead. No, never mind. Between the two of them, they can create sort of, criminal, legislation on us, let's just call it that for now. And what I mean by that is, like, for example, Congress could create the Major Crimes Act, which we talk about a lot in criminal law too, which applies on the res, right? It's a federal piece of legislation which applies in any country, related to however many, I forget however many major crimes exist, and that provides, I think it's 13 or something too, murder, rape, kidnapping, etc. I think kidnapping's in there. But, all right, so the feds can obviously do that, but yes, the states can do it too, right? The state of North Dakota has its police, right? State of North Dakota can decide, oh, we want the police to camp out at Fort Rice and do the pipeline stuff, whatever, okay? State of North Dakota can decide.
States, are they able to do intercommerce, interstate commerce?
Yes, so when we talk about commerce, great distinction, when we talk about commerce, actually, we're gonna,
So this would be like a national, right?
we're gonna put,
Or there you go, international.
yeah, or actually interstate, which is really hard to, so I'll talk about interstate commerce, and remember, and then on this side, we got intra-state, and inter and intra are like these really crazy words, because inter you think was like in something, inter is actually like interstate, like from one. Exactly, yep, so states can, to a certain extent, control intrastate commerce, but that's been severely limited, right? We think back on even the wheat case, right? So there are serious potential limitations to that. But one way a state might do that is it might control who it gives liquor licenses to, right? Or who it gives, whatever else. So certainly that's a state power. Last time we talked about, or not last time, 2 classes ago, we talked about how when the government was formed, it included the ability to make a national bank, okay? It included the ability, and then there was a second bank that came after that, after the War of 1812, okay? So the federal government has the ability to make banks. Can states make banks?
Yes.
Actually, they can.
Really? Yes.
You wouldn't think it.
Because they can do it with the county.
Yeah, they can. So both of them can make banks. Who even knew? State banks. I know, I tell you what, charter banks, you can use that, but banks is fine. Come April, oh good, Candace, is it April 14th? What happens on April 15th? April 15th, what happens on April 15th? Federal taxes, where did you go? Oh, federal taxes, so the feds can tax us. What about the states?
Yes. But only in certain states, because some don't have a state law to pay the state.
Depends, yeah, for income tax, they might sell property tax. A lot of them defray their income tax, but then have giant.
Texas and South Dakota.
New Hampshire.
I don't know.
Yep. But they have giant property taxes. South Dakota actually doesn't have that bad of property taxes for how little state income taxes, which is nothing. And also, that's where you might have a change depending on whether you're native or not, right? Whether the state can tax it. Like if you live on the res, do all your, work and whatever on the res, you may or may not have to pay state taxes. So that's a little bit of a thing in there, but taxation, totally a power of both of them. States can also establish local governments. So for example, if they want to incorporate a city, things like that, they can conduct elections. Yes, some of the elections are federal too, but the state has the ability to actually conduct them. As you mentioned, international stuff before, the feds generally do have that international ability. Some of that might be on the executive branch too. So we can note though, and states also have their own, both of them have parks, right? And park system things like there are things that we can think of that each do in their own way. But there are certainly some things that states can do, feds can't do, and vice versa. And today we're looking predominantly at things that the federal government can do. And let me tell you, if you're a states' rights person, when the American government was founded, states' rights were really strong. Every state was really looking to have its own separate government. And even when the Constitution was ratified, that's part of the reason they included the Bill of Rights. They wanted the Bill of Rights included to make sure that those state governments stayed strong and individuals stayed strong. Over the years, however, things have gotten more and more, especially through the Commerce Clause, under federal government control. And that's not necessarily a bad thing or good thing, depending on how you look at it. It just is how things have shifted. And so now there is a lot more potential. And we'll talk about why that is in a bit. But whereas things started off more in this direction, things are now maybe more in this direction. But this interchange right here, states versus federal government, states versus federal government, that is federalism. Federalism. All right. Sidebar here. Last time in class, we're just going to take a step away from federalism for a second, so that you can rejuvenate your minds and be ready for when we get back to it. But Elizabeth, as she was leading class last week, asked, how do you know if laws are current? And what she meant by that is, we talked about precedential value. And so it might be that, 1780, the Supreme Court says, yes, legal, right? But then 1850, they say no. 1970, yes, but test. Okay, whatever the case may be. And what you would go by is the most recent decision, right? That's precedential value. That has the highest precedential value, assuming they're all Supreme Court decisions. The Supreme Court is the one who creates the main decisions of precedent. So after that, for example, if you have a state law and you're looking for someone who interprets that, if it's not something that's a constitutional right, then it might be interpreted by the state Supreme Court, and they would probably have the highest precedential value. Remember, we've got our separate court systems. On one side, we have a state court system where you can have a trial court, and an appellate court, and a Supreme Courts of the state. But then on the other side, we've got the big giant system, which is the district court, and then the Court of Appeals, and then the U.S. Supreme Court. And district court is obviously a large swath of the country, different states go to certain district courts, depending, or in certain districts, I should say, go to a district court, you might go to Court of Appeals. If you're unhappy with a state court decision, maybe appeal over to the federal system, depending on whether or not the Supreme Court has original jurisdiction in states. That's a little bit within Article 3, 4, 5, 5 of the Constitution. But anyway, so you're trying to figure out, we have all those cases we did last time. There in my SPC that Candace has copies of about 2,000 pages worth. And something like that, right? And so in those cases, there might be pieces which are still good law, and there might be pieces which more recent precedent has overturned. And so that's a tricky thing to try to figure out, You're like, but most of the cases that we're going to cover in this class are still good law, and they're cited often. That's why we're talking about them. So for example, if we look back onto, let's see, Ogden versus Oh goodness, Ogden versus, who is Ogden versus, I want to say Nash, it's not Nash. Gibbons, oh, Gibbons. Ogden versus Gibbons, we look back to that, that might still be cited for certain Commerce Clause propositions, or might be cited a number of times. But Elizabeth asked me, I'm trying to figure out what the most recent law is as defined by the Supreme Court. So obviously, Congress, state legislature, or US Congress creates laws, and then courts define them in the sense of figuring out the limits of those laws. And so you're trying to figure out what the most current deal is. One place that has this kind of information is a place called Westlaw. It's one of the really big organizations. We used to have a contract for Westlaw here at the college, and it cost about, we had a really discounted contract. It cost about $1,200 a year though, still, which is quite a bit, you know, if you don't have students using it all the time. That being said, there are, if you get an individual subscription, for example, if I wanted to get a subscription as an attorney, it might be even significantly more than that. And depending on what you choose to pay for, you know, you might get various insights like examples of briefs or other legal work areas. You might be able to look at certain treatises and you pay more. Treatises are basically books of definitions of laws or books of examples of cases that have dealt with certain laws. But for a site like Westlaw, what you would do is you go to the Westlaw website, you plug in like your case citation. Your case citation it looks something like 138 S court, you know, 17 or US 17 or federal court or 17 or whatever. It would have basically how to access within one of the named court reporters, and by reporter, I don't mean a person, I mean a like journal. It have how to access certain documents within the case here. So the name, so that's usually the first two named parties, Gibbons versus Ogden, for example. The citation, where to find it, and that's an easy thing to paste into Google or whatever, within a year to make sure you're on the right case. But some cases, same name, but different years. They should have different citations too. But so Westlaw is one example of where you can do that. Another one is a site called LexisNexis. Both Westlaw and LexisNexis have, Westlaw I believe calls it P-Site. LexisNexis calls it Shepherds. And they basically tell you whether this decision has been questioned by another court, whether it has been approved by another court, like cited by another court positively. Like, for example, they would say, as they said in Gibbons versus Ogden, the Commerce Clause, you know, allows Congress to regulate the waterways of the United States or navigation of the waterways, okay? So that would be sort of a positive site, maybe a neutral site, and maybe how many they're cited. So if you were looking for a case that was good law, and that is subjective to an extent, which is interesting, it's not necessarily objective, you would look to see, are there a ton of warnings, a ton of positives, how many people have cited it, and try to figure out if it was a case that matched the facts enough to what you were arguing or whatever. So basically, if you had a case, like today we're gonna look at some cases about milk. If you had a case about milk and you looked and you found a case about beets, but it had a huge amount of warnings on it, but it said what you needed it to say, maybe you would try to distinguish from that case a little bit. You'd say something like, well, in the Supreme Court said in this case about beets this. Now, this is a case about milk, so it's a little bit different, and that's why the same law doesn't apply. Now, milk and beets, probably too easy of a distinction there, you know, probably wouldn't fly, but you can imagine distinguishing your topic from something that maybe has some more recent bad law about it. But Westlaw, LexisNexis, two of the main databases. There's also a place called Fastcase. I put some of the cost information for Fastcase down here. So for Fastcase, to get access to Supreme Court decisions, appeals decisions, district court decisions, and bankruptcy court, et cetera, decisions, plus a couple other things, your basic plan, you might be looking at paying from $700 to $1,000 a year. And you know what the like theft of this all is? is that all these things are free public information, okay? Like all these things are, sometimes Westlaw has its own reporters, or LexisNexis has its own reporters, its own journals where it compiles these things. And they try to get you to pay for them in the sense because they have, at the top, they'll have like head notes. They'll say, this is what the court is saying here. This is what the court is saying here. They try to make it easier for you to read the case, okay?
But you can find it free.
But you can find the case for free. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. But it might be a little bit of work, depending on if it's like a district court in Louisiana somewhere, you know, and if that district court keeps all their stuff online, easily accessible, whatever, like it might just, you can look on Pacer. Actually, I didn't put Pacer up here. But Pacer, PACER is probably one of the easiest places to find that information. There's a ton of information on Pacer. You can read briefs and other things too that parties have submitted for various cases. But the benefits using a service like LexisNexis or Westlaw, or maybe even Fastcase, is that you get things either shepherdized or key cited. You get to find out if things are up to date. They have already gone through, they've maybe made a summary of the case for you. Okay, they've done some amount of work and they're charging you because they've done that amount of work. Now, you can, however, find these things online for free. And I get most of the cases for this class from the Library of Congress. Basically, the Library of Congress has an enormous amount of American government documents and other documents for free. And all you can do is, like, today we are looking at, let's see here. Today we are looking at, well, let's just look at Gibbons versus Ogden again. You could just copy that case citation. You could go on right up there to the Library of Congress, go to their website. Sometimes my computer's a little slow when I'm doing the Zoom recording too. And you could just paste right in there the case citation, or you could paste in there the name of the case. My computer is, oh, there it is a little bit slow. You can just paste in there the name of the case. You can just, it is like, it is rolling. See, it's the issue with having, like, wanting to use your own laptop because you don't like the Windows one. It's sometimes a little bit slow. All right, let's go back. Well, just trust me. You can paste in there the case citation. It'll bring up the case. In addition to the case, they'll bring up anything else it has which references that case. So if you're looking for more information about that case, ooh, look at that. It's not me. No, actually, I get this all the time. And so I think that if you annoy it, if you push send too many times, it just gives you this. And then I just have to retry it again. In addition to Library of Congress, though, there are, you know, I'm going to be frank, none of them are as good as, say, Westlaw or LexisNexis, okay? But there are some free legal research sites too. And those can be useful. You can find, for example, you can find the copies of most cases on Google Scholar. You just got to type in the name of the case. You can find them on some of them on the Supreme Court website. You can find commentary on the cases in various places. Cornell has a really amazing, I forget what it's called, the Legal Institute or something like that, which contains a lot of basic case information. LexisNexis, I'll show you this later, has some free case briefs. We're going to talk about what a brief is in a bit. It's kind of like a short version of a case for those of you who are interested in shorter versions of cases. So we'll look at that. So there is a lot of information. Basically, if you've got the case citation, which is the name, the site, and then the year, you can plug that in to your search engine. You can generally find some, probably a copy of the case somewhere. You might have to look through one of these databases too, or you can find other information on the case, which will be useful for later on when we do that. All right, so today we're going to just breeze through some of these topics from your book. We're going to look at state commerce, regulated commerce, the nature the power, the subject of regulation, the Cooley Doctrine, modern approach, balancing of interest, discrimination, undue burdens. We're going to touch on that just a few minutes today. State as market participant, and we won't get too deep into privileges and immunities. Talking about what Congress speaks, preemption, and legitimization. So back to, like, it's a book that you don't have to have. Oh, it's a book that you can have if you want to. It's on the syllabus. Somebody got it. Did you buy it? Somebody got it. They were telling me about it. Oh, Elizabeth or Sterling. But I think Tracy forgot to order it, so I made it optional. I'm just putting your readings online. It's fine. Don't worry about it. It's a cheap book though, if you want it. And I'm moving forward in these classes. I think I'm gonna, in the future classes I teach, I have, oh goodness, I have one of Wayne's books from last semester. I used the same book for one of my classes, and Lachey, that book was like $230. And I thought, oh my goodness, $230, and you're gonna open it 12 times and then never again. And so I will, when it can be good to have. Yeah, it can, if you're gonna use it though, right? And if it's information that you can't find for free on the internet. And I'm a big fan of the old internet these days because you can search within text for something too, right? So you're looking at, what do I do in this scenario? What is the procedure for interviewing a witness? You know, maybe that's a better way to do it. But all right, so back on over to federalism knowledge. This is part actually of they have advanced placement tests courses in high schools. So these are some questions from the US government advanced placement tests. You're just gonna kind of pre-test together and think about the answers to these questions, and then we'll launch into more of actually looking at what these answers are. Article 1, Section 8 gives Congress the ability or the power to pass all laws necessary and proper to carry out its enumerated powers. These powers are known as, you're going to take a guess. So enumerated. Article 1, Section 8 gives Congress the power to pass all necessary and proper all laws necessary and proper to carry out its enumerated powers. These powers are known as, and this is enumerated up there. Under the Constitution, national and state governments are, they don't share any powers, they're accountable to the people, they can regulate interstate commerce, or they're totally autonomous. Are they totally autonomous? Yes. National and state governments? Oh no, they can share sometimes. Can states regulate interstate commerce? No. They share some powers, all right? So they're accountable to people. It's basically just an exclusionary one there, but it doesn't really mean anything, but to take away the other one says. Among the current or concurrent powers of the US system are, so concurrent powers are what's in the middle of that Venn diagram, right? We got states, feds, concurrent powers. Among the concurrent powers are, and someone correctly said this one earlier today, is it coining money, establishing national courts, taxation, or all of the above? What can states and feds do? One more time, Shay. Just your ones and reds earlier. What happens on people? Taxation. States and taxes. Wait, feds and taxes. Well, banks. Banks. Oh, they both actually, you know what? They both can make. No, they both can make courts, but not national courts. Oh, okay. That's this AP course, I tell you what. So you're right, because no, you're absolutely right. I'm so sorry. You're absolutely right, because obviously states can have courts, right? States can have their own court system. We talked about that. But the old national courts trying to trick us up here. Yeah, taxation. National laws, and actually, I think the answer they're looking for on number one is oddly enough, it's implied powers. Yeah, it's not, and looks kind of silly. It's because the enumerated powers to pass all laws which are necessary and proper in order to carry out its enumerated power. So basically, it's trying to trick us, and this is what the safety test does, but it's saying that there's the enumerated powers, okay, the power to make banks, and then there's the ability for Congress to pass laws to actually fulfill those enumerated powers. So it's not just making banks, it's then passing the law related to how the bank is gonna run, how the and these are called the implied powers. But it's a tricky question. It should be enumerated powers in a sense, because you have your basic enumerated powers, but then you've also got your implied powers. All right, national laws that direct state or local governments to comply with federal rules or regulations, but do not use funds to help defray costs. This one is a little bit more obvious. You've got Contracts in America, block grants, unfunded mandates, or Freemasons. National laws that direct state or local governments to comply with federal rules or regulations, but do not include funds to help defray the costs. A, not a bad guess. Yes, good guess. C. C, block grants, not a bad guess. D. D, it's actually none of those. It happens to be B. I think if there was an E, one of you would have guessed E too. No, so actually, unfunded mandates, this one is a little bit maybe more obvious from, I thought it was more obvious because it said unfunded, but I take it back. But national laws that direct state or local governments to comply with federal rules and regulations, but do not include funds to help defray costs are called unfunded mandates. And let me tell you, states not that happy about necessarily following unfunded mandates, right? States might do something if they have to, if there's maybe some benefit to them for doing it. But if the feds say you need to do this and we're not providing any money for you to do it, some states might be like, well, I don't know if I want to do that or not. You know,
like that case with the age.
Exactly. That's exactly what it is. That's the Federal Highway Administration saying that's exactly what it was. I believe that was like Reagan. Reagan wanted there to be a national drinking age, 21. I think it was him. Sorry if it wasn't. And Federal Highway Administration or Federal Transportation Administration or somebody says, look guys, in order to get federal funding, you guys have to change your state age. And South Dakota, Denver Bucky, says we are not going to do it. You know, and since they get in a legal fight, right? And the federal government wins, right? Because under the Commerce Clause, but also under necessary and proper, they get to do that because they're, you know, they put the rule down and provided funding. In order to get the funding, you had to do it, right? I'll tell you, way back in the day, among the places I lived was near Fairbanks, Alaska. I lived in a town near Fairbanks, Alaska. And right next to Fairbanks, Alaska, is a town called North Pole, Alaska. North Pole, Alaska. There's a military base in North Pole, Alaska. You know what there also is in North Pole, Alaska? Was shaking a guess. North Pole, Alaska. Candace, can you guess? Santa Claus! Santa Claus is in North Pole, Alaska. Where did you think he was?
I was say that. I was like, I don't know.
Santa Claus, both of you. Nobody wrote a letter to Santa when they were a kid?
I mean, yeah.
Well, I mean, there's no such thing as Santa, except that there is a guy in North Pole, Alaska, in a big house where all the letters to Santa Claus go. If you write a letter to Santa Claus in Alaska, it goes to this guy who sits in it, probably a couple guys, right? They change the same outfit or whatever. In North Pole, I've been in that house. I did not sit on his lap, not my thing. anyway, North Pole, Alaska. North Pole, Alaska. Speaking of Bucky,
So they get all the letters and they read them.
and they reply to them. There's a committee of old ladies who sits and tries to reply to them all. No, I don't know if that's true anymore, but I think that they did, or they might even, they do try, maybe they might try to reply to them. But it's a huge attraction. Okay? It's like the main thing North Pole, apart from the Army base or Air Force base or whatever it is. North Pole though gets cold. Fairbanks, I mean, down here it gets to be -40 or so. Fairbanks gets to be -40 for days and days on end. When I lived in Fairbanks, I worked in the borough mayor's office. Alaska doesn't have counties, it has boroughs, and the boroughs are huge. Like the Fairbanks North Star borough where I worked was the size of multiple states. And I worked with the mayor and also with some of the state senators, like the national state senators for Alaska would stop by the office a lot. Lisa Murkowski, Don Young at that point, representative. But anyway, so I would get up at, I lived in a cabin. This is a common thing. This will only be a short story. I lived in a what they call the dry cabin. And I had moved to Alaska from Cherokee Nation. I was working with Cherokee Nation building Boys and Girls Clubs, 7 Boys and Girls Clubs in Northeast Oklahoma. And I moved up to Alaska in February. It was -40. I rented a dry cabin. Alaska has a permafrost line. So north of the permafrost line, you can't dig a well, basically, because the ground is frozen all year round. Like, I mean, so basically outside of the city limits, people either have damp cabins or dry cabins. Dry cabins are not set up for water at all. You go in an outhouse, there's an outhouse outside. Damp cabins have plumbing infrastructure, but you have to haul in your own water. So I lived in a dry cabin in the middle of the woods, on Army Road near University of Alaska Fairbanks. And every morning at 6 a.m., I would walk from my dry cabin for about an hour to University of Alaska Fairbanks to catch a bus to go into the city of Fairbanks. It'd be -40, and it was February, it was Alaska, and I would wear everything I owned because I didn't have a ton of money and I didn't want to spend it on heating my poor dry cabin. So during the day, everything in the dry cabin would freeze. Like every shampoo, every whatever else would freeze. And that meant also if you had to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, you had to run outside to your outhouse in -40 degrees, which is really not the most pleasant thing. But all that is to say that Fairbanks and North Pole are in a basin. People assume Alaska is beautiful. Other parts of Alaska are, Fairbanks proper, maybe not so much. In a basin, and they have really bad air quality. And Alaska has a lot of big giant forest fires. There were times that during the summer when the forest fires were going on, I'd be in Fairbanks and it would look like it was snowing. And it wasn't snow, it was all ash from the forest fires. I'd never seen anything like it, pretty crazy. But North Pole, this is such a long story, you'll remember it now maybe. North Pole, people like to burn whatever they wanted to burn in North Pole, okay? If they wanted to stick something in their fireplace, use batteries, plastic, whatever else, they didn't want no one telling them what to do, okay? Well, their air quality was even worse than Fairbanks. It was really bad. And Fairbanks had a coal power plant, a power plant that burned coal in order to create electricity for the city. It might still have it. Again, different world, okay? But North Pole, the EPA was providing them with money for a lot of money for certain parts of their government or certain parts of whatever they were doing in the city. North Pole said, we are not going to regulate what people can burn in their fire pits or their fireplaces. And so that's what North Pole said. The EPA said, that's fine, but we are not going to provide you with any funding. Until your air quality changes, we're not going to provide you with any funding, and that's a way in which you have a mandate, which actually is a funded mandate because you're having funds withheld that otherwise would be provided in order to get states to fall in line or municipalities, local governments, which are within states to fall in line, okay? So if you wonder, like, how can the US government get a local, if McLaughlin decides to do something that's against the EPA, McLaughlin decides to do something that's against whatever, how can the federal government step in? Well, this is how they can step in, right? And sure enough, the North Pole had to get in line and regulate what people were burning in their fireplaces, which is probably for the best. I'm all for letting people do what they want, but there's probably a limit. All right, so in situations of conflict between state and national law, national law prevails due to,
I say A.
I say you're right, supremacy clause. Moving on, the clause that ensures the judicial decrees and contracts made in one state will be binding and enforceable in another is called the, this one might be a common sense one too. You just use supremacy. What are the chances of being supremacy again? Oh, you're right. There is a supremacy clause, and we haven't. Yeah, we might not have talked about this clause much.
Not A.
It's not a good call.
Yep.
And based on what I've said, it's probably not B.
Yeah.
What decisions in South Dakota, court decisions have to be enforced in North Dakota. States give full faith and credit to each other. They basically give, I'll give you full faith and credit from this decision to this decision. The 10th Amendment provides for, 10th Amendment provides for, oh, here's the deal. Don't have to answer that question because the next, oh, go ahead. Lachey thinks it's A though. Concurrent powers. Oh. Lachey is like gonna answer this one. Lachey is still feeling bad about this Freemasons, choosing Freemasons. All right, here's the 10th Amendment. Lachey, would you read this? Can you read it then? Candace, can you read that?
Powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution or prohibited by it to the state are reserved to the state respectively or.
All right, so states reserves for police powers, C for that one, okay? 10th Amendment. It's gonna be an important one for today. The old 10th Amendment. That is the reserved rights for the states. Now, there are certainly implied powers within the Constitution, those implied and not necessarily enumerated powers within the Constitution for the United States government to enforce the Constitution. But there are vis-a-vis the 10th Amendment, these reserved powers to the states. So we learned a little bit about these last week when we talked about McCulloch versus Maryland. That was that case about the establishment of a national bank. And the question was whether or not Congress had implied powers or only those that were enumerated. And it was decided that, yes, this government is one of enumerated powers, but that Article 1, Section 8, necessary and proper, that language provided, all laws shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution, provided these sort of implied powers, right? Provided these implied powers, as the former slide said. So yes, federalism was designed that states would retain certain rights, but in order to execute the Constitution, we had to assume that there were certain powers there that weren't necessarily enumerated. Let's just remember, enumerated, number means like number of lists, things that aren't listed. So unenumerated, things that aren't listed or just not enumerated, things that are maybe implied. And McCulloch versus Maryland looked to that. So let the end be legitimate, let it be within the scope of the Constitution. All means which are appropriate, which are plainly adapted to that end, which are not prohibited, but which consist and are consistent with the letter and spirit of the Constitution. So letter and spirit of the Constitution, we have these implied powers for Congress that go along with the enumerated powers. Last week, we also talked about Gibbons and Ogden. Gibbons and Ogden, Candace, what's Gibbons and Ogden about again?
The
Steamboats, yep. And something, the cute video wanted to make it about like a sappy divorce story or something, I think. But I think it's just draw people and I kind of phrase it in that ways that it got to immediately say after I talked about the case. Don't listen to what your professor said about this case. This is a love story. But Gibbons and Ogden, Congress gave federal license to one steamship operators and New York gave one to the other. Judge Marshall said navigation is within the term commerce. Marshall said to regulate commerce, this power, like all those vested in Congress, is complete within itself, may be exercised to its utmost extent, and acknowledge no limitation other than that than are prescribed in the Constitution. So this power to regulate commerce is plenary, and that it's able to regulate within multiple states. We have this commerce clause thing too. So we've gone through sort of necessary and proper clause, again, commerce clause. We looked at both of those last week. Today, we're not going to do too many cases in class today because we're going to have the fun of going over to the computer lab here in a bit and doing a couple of cases there. But one case for today is Cooley versus the Board of Wardens of Philadelphia. Now, what happened in Cooley is there was a rule in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, that if you were to have a steamship which either left from Philadelphia or came into port at Philadelphia, not a steamship, I take it back, any kind of boat, probably selling goods, okay? It doesn't have to be a steamship, sorry, I want a steamship roll. But a boat comes in or leaves from that port, they need to pay a certain tax or pay a certain fine if the pilot of that boat is not from Pennsylvania, okay? Or maybe Philadelphia, but I think it's Pennsylvania. So pilot has to be, I think they call them, I guess it's a captain, but I believe the language of this case called them pilots. Pilot of that boat needs to be from Pennsylvania. If that pilot is not from Pennsylvania, then you, as the operator, have to pay 50% of whatever the license fee is for a pilot in that state to the state, and the state then distributes it among all the retired and aging pilots or captains' families. So basically, it takes that money that out-of-state pilots are contributing, that 50% of whatever pilot license is, and then gives it to people in the states in order to contribute to their retirements or their upkeep after they've finished up. So in Cooley, the court basically looked at this sort of selective exclusiveness and looked at whether or not the dormant commerce clause, so again, we've got the commerce clause which says the Constitution that the federal government controls all commerce, and we've got this sort of implied or negative or dormant commerce clause, which isn't enumerated, but it is implied, that basically says, well, that means that states don't control interstate commerce, right? And so the court looks at whether this dormant commerce clause precludes state regulations and decides that it is selective. You need to look to the actual events that are occurring and make a decision thereupon. And this is the basis for many of our cases today, this idea that you're going to look to what's actually happening in the situation. You're not necessarily always going to side with the states. You're not necessarily always going to side with the federal government, but you're going to look to what is happening in the situation. And today we'll go through some of the tests that have to do with that. I know you're thinking like today we will. We're already a little ways in, but there's a little more. So today we'll go through some of the sort of balancing tests that the courts do. Now, one of the things that the courts have struggled with is sometimes they get topics which they don't know anything about. Right? Sometimes they get a really intense economic or financial or specialized topic that they don't know what's kind of about it. So they also have to consider whether or not they know enough about it. So this Cooley doctrine, though, basically says, Congress has exclusive power to regulate national commerce matters, and states share this power in the absence of federal preemption with respect to local matters. So actually, they ruled in this case in favor of Philadelphia, in favor of Pennsylvania. They ruled that you could actually potentially have a policy like this, provided there was no federal preemption. And by federal preemption, I kind of mean back to the supremacy clause. If there's a federal law already in place, you can't have a state law which does something different. All right, you have to defer to the federal government. All right. And the court does it in this case because they're saying, look, yes, Congress does have the ability to regulate interstate commerce and all of that. But in this case, we're only talking about commerce that's actually happening in Philadelphia. There's no license to go in the navigable waters outside, maybe. And there was a dissent in this case, and I kind of go along with the dissent for some of this, but it's looking to the fact that maybe there are things, unlike the boat licenses in Gibbons versus Ogden, which states can actually regulate, and in absence of federal regulations can regulate. And so they ultimately find it is okay for Pennsylvania to have this statute requiring boats entering or leaving to have local pilots or to pay. Now this is probably not law that you'd cite for much nowadays because it has mostly probably been overturned, and if not overturned, then modified to the extent which is sort of unrecognizable and not useful these days. But it does show that at the beginning of this government, yes, there was some federal push in cases like Gibbons versus Ogden, but then there was also some realization or making or showing of states' rights amongst this too. And so that's this sort of Cooley principle that if the feds haven't regulated it yet, states might be able to regulate it. But again, it would have to be something that's intrastate. Looking at West Lynn Creamery, one of our milk cases. I don't know if I put more than one in here, but there are more than one. I think there's one in your homework too. This is a more recent case, and I jump ahead to this one. Actually, let me see. Maybe we'll. Oh, it's okay. We can jump ahead to West Lynn Creamery. So in West Lynn Creamery, you have milk prices. Milk prices are off. The milk farmers, the dairy farmers, the people who own cows, they are in trouble. Massachusetts wants to stick up for them. It does not want to, have its milk prices be so down or its farmers go out of business or whatever else. And so it says, we are going to regulate the milk that is being sold to retailers by dealers in the state of Massachusetts. And we're going to put a tax on it. And we're going to do it across the board. This is 1994. They're well aware of these commerce clause cases. They're well aware that they can't tax only milk that's coming into the state. So they decide, look, we're going to apply this to everyone. But it happens that 2/3 of the dealers are out-of-state dealers, okay, that are selling milk. So any milk that comes in to retailers from out of state, which accounts for about 2/3 of the milk, is then taxed at a rate. It's taxed at this rate. I don't know why I put this in here, but it's $15 less than the federal price for 100 pounds. I'm basically just showing that it fluctuates based on what the federal price for milk is at that time. There's federal prices for wheat, federal prices for different things. And so they then do this really similar thing that we just, well, this is why I put this in this order, because we just talked about Cooley. They do this really similar thing that Cooley did in 1852. Okay, the state of Massachusetts decides it's going to give all the money from this tax to the dairy farmers, just like Cooley gave it to the wives and boat pilots or boat captains and their families, in order to sort of support them. All right, distributes money amongst these Massachusetts dairy farmers. Now, the Supreme Court. So actually, it goes up, and we call this the procedural posture or the procedure. There's a couple different names for it, like describing what happened in previous courts. And so in previous courts, there's 2 Massachusetts dealers who buy milk from out of state. They don't want to have to pay this $15 less for each 100 pounds, or this amount. I guess it's less than 50. It's less. It's more than that, obviously. For each 100 pounds, they don't want to have to pay this. And Massachusetts gets their license revoked. So they seek an injunction. An injunction basically is a court order to do something or to not do something. We talk about damages a little bit. We think about damages when we're doing something in civil court, but an alternate remedy is what's called an injunction. It's to get someone to do something or not do something. Go to a tribal court and ask, Joe Bob to move that car off of your property because it's been there forever and it's your property and it shouldn't be on there. or alternately for the remedy of damages for however much it's going to cost you to move it. But so they seek an injunction under the Commerce Clause. They lose. They lose at district court and they lose at the state of Massachusetts Supreme Court. Can you believe that they lost? They lost about a Massachusetts law in the Massachusetts courts. Well, you should believe, right? There's a home court advantage, right? You gotta, just like baseball, basketball. Baseball is played on court. Home court advantage. Basketball, you're right now. You know, you got the gym here full of people, and they're all cheering you on, right? When you're at home. Whereas if you go over to Newtown and you're playing basketball, and everyone's like cheering on Newtown or cheering on standing around 4 days. So you get home court advantage. You got home court advantage in state courts too. And that's why oftentimes in litigation, when you have one party who's suing someone else, they try to do it. They could maybe do it in that person's home state court. That's a little bit of a procedure that we won't get into today. But frequently they want to do it in their own court system. They want to sue them. Usually they might have an option of where to sue them depending. It's called a venue. They might have an option of venue, but they oftentimes want to do it within their own court system because sometimes there is sort of this home court advantage, to borrow that phrase from basketball. So anyway, so these people who are trying to get out of the Massachusetts law go through the Massachusetts court system, which rules against them, upholds Massachusetts law. It's appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court says, no. It says you can't do this. It says the purpose and effect of the order were to enable higher cost Massachusetts dairy farmers to compete with lower cost farmers in other places. The tax was effectively imposed, even though they didn't say it's only for out-of-state dealers, because 2/3 of the dealers were from out of state, or were buying milk from out of state. It was effectively imposed on out-of-state products. The order would almost most certainly cause local goods to constitute a greater share. They would cause out-of-state goods to be a smaller share. By distributing monies directly to Massachusetts dairy farmers, the order ensured that Massachusetts producers would benefit. So again, you've got a swinging out to Massachusetts. And that the order is unconstitutional even if the tax on milk sales and the subsidy to Massachusetts dairy farmers would each be constitutional standing alone. So it looks sort of this combining a legitimate subsidy, which is providing the subsidy to those dairy farmers who were down and out, and a non-discriminatory tax. You're not saying it's only for out-of-state people, you're saying it's for all people, but the effect is discriminatory. And by discriminatory, I mean discriminatory against out-of-state milk producers. Okay, so it said even though you've got these two things which independently are not offensive to the Commerce Clause, the fact is when you combine them, you get this effect which creates a Commerce Clause violation. You get what I mean by that? And so this is how kind of in the weeds it gets, and how states, even recently, states look to get around Commerce Clause regulations, right? It didn't look into, no, it just knocked it down. But you can probably rest assured, I don't know the actual like who signed on to different briefs, but it might very well be that when this case went to the Supreme Court, you have amicus briefs from parties who are in support either way, and it might be that the U.S. government or the U.S. Department of Commerce or somebody wrote a brief on behalf of the dairy farmers and said, look, we think this violates the Commerce Clause, you know? And Massachusetts has a lot of lawyers and law schools. It's like Minneapolis, like there are a lot of colleges in Massachusetts. Did you know that? A lot of colleges in Massachusetts. Can you name a college in Massachusetts? Harvard's in Massachusetts. Harvard, MIT, Northeastern, Boston College, Boston University, Emerson, Suffolk, Brandeis, a lot of colleges in Massachusetts. Now you know. I think there's even more than that, and I just can't think of them. Anyway, a lot of lawyers, and so they must have known they were, coming up against the law a little bit here. But all states do this. All states push, and if they don't get pushed back, might be able to move on with something. And also they sometimes push in order to move Supreme Court precedents, Supreme Court precedents, it's not the same stuff in 1850 as it is today. How the Supreme Court interprets things has changed, and it changes consistently with the times, right? Laws have changed, or interpretations of laws as constitutional or not constitutional have changed over time. And so sometimes states and others run test cases to see if they can get away with doing certain things, and maybe a bunch of other states might have signed on with them, or a bunch of other states might have submitted amicus briefs. And if the Supreme Court had ruled in the state's favor, you might have seen similar things being done by other states, but it didn't in this case. Candace, you want to take a break for a second? Are you all right? Good. Oh, cantaloupes in Arizona. Cantaloupes in Arizona. Arizona. We are getting into a little bit of balancing here. Balancing. Bruce Church grows some fancy cantaloupes. Grows them in Arizona. Great place to grow things. What else can you grow in Arizona? Chili. Love them. Green chilies. Love them. Wonder Hatch green chilies, but Hatch is in New Mexico in it. Yeah. Have you been in Hatch? Yep. Yeah, me too. A number of times. What do you call it? A ristra? Yeah, when you get like a bunch of hanging red chilies, I buy them sometimes. I think they're called ristras. I bought some in Hatch, as does everyone. They have them lining the streets there, right? Not very many streets in Hatch. I think it's like 2. So weird. Do you have an Apple Watch? It's really amazing. If your heart rate is up, your heart rate is down, somebody's calling you, somebody's messaging you. It's like you know who Pavlov was? Pavlov, a social psychologist. He did this awful thing where he'd like shock dogs if they did things wrong. It's a Pavlovian whatever. Anyhow, I always feel like it's like it's shocking me if I it's like some terrible thing. Okay, Michelle, we are talking about cantaloupes. How do you feel about cantaloupes? Oh. Are they hello? Yeah. Do you? Yeah. Allergic to cantaloupes. Cantaloupes. I don't know. Huh? So they actually have some in the garden over there, but I don't know if they're cantaloupes or melons. But somebody told me they are musk melons. Musk melons. They look like cantaloupes though. They're in the garden over there by the security house. So there's like melons and then there's cantaloupes, and I don't really know what the difference is. Watermelon is cantaloupe, but it's like is it a honeydew? I think honeydew. Is a honeydew a cantaloupe? Yeah. Oh. Jeez, Cass. There goes our plan to have a melon party in this class. I don't think she's sorry, Lachette. So we got Bruce Church is growing cantaloupes in Arizona. He's shipping them to California, okay? And we get the state of Arizona. The state of Arizona saying, you are growing cantaloupes in Arizona. They need to say grown in Arizona on it. Yes, why would that be a state idea? Why would the state want that to happen?
I would say because it's only specific to that region.
Might be only specific, and it's a business decision. It's like the state wants to promote its cantaloupes. It wants to say, come to Arizona, where we get the best cantaloupes. It wants to draw in the business.
Well, I mean, I say that because you can't grow Hatch chili up here.
Oh, or it's specialized, yes.
Right.
Well, so that's interesting. They actually, I don't know if we don't do any copyright law in this class, but whenever I talk about copyright law, I talk about sort of this European model of when the EU was created, the European Union, right? When the EU was created, they did, for different countries, they allowed those countries to effectively kind of copyright some of their cuisine or some of their traditional foods that they created. So it used to be that people in, say, Finland could make fake champagne, all right? If Finland joined the EU, they signed on, they had to agree that the word champagne could only be used for certain types of wine that came from the Champagne region of France. So Merlot, same thing, whatever, you know. So they decided for England, there's something like the Scotch pies. Scotch pies could only be called Scotch pies and sold as Scotch pies in the European Union if they came from this region of England. And this was to try to keep things from becoming more homogenous. They were worried the individual people, this is almost like federalism in a way, the individual countries in the EU were worried, oh, if we join on to this EU thing, we become like this big confederacy. What if we lose our identity? What if we lose our sense of self? And so this was something that was incorporated in. Certain types of cheeses have to be from certain regions, things like that. Kind of interesting. So though, Arizona cantaloupes, Bruce Church grows his cantaloupes, sells them. The state of Arizona gets upset because he doesn't put on them that they were grown in Arizona. In order for him to put those on to his crop, his special cantaloupes, it would cost him between $200,000 and $700,000 per crop. It'd be really expensive for Bruce Church, okay? And he's not selling them in Arizona. He's just getting them right over to California. And he's like, I can't do this. I can't afford to do it. I'm just this guy, right? The Supreme Court agrees with Church, actually. They say, so you would think like, oh, you know, is there this ability for Arizona to regulate this? And in the absence of Congress regulating it, which we talked about earlier with the Cooley Doctrine, in the absence of Congress regulating it, there might be the ability for the state to regulate it, even though it is interstate commerce and you get the issues there. But in this case, the Supreme Court says, no way, this is too much of a burden on interstate commerce. And it's a burden on his ability to sell this anywhere, you know? So they create this balancing test, this benefits versus burdens. Where the statute regulates even handedly to effectuate a legitimate public interest, in this case, it might be a legitimate public interest, and its effects on interstate commerce are only incidental, Its effects are only incidental. The effects here were clearly more than incidental. They were substantial. It will be upheld unless the burden imposed on such commerce is clearly excessive in relation to the putative local benefits. If a legitimate local purpose is found, then the question becomes one of degree. And the extent of the burden that will be tolerated will, of course, depend on the nature of the local interest involved and whether or not it could be promoted as well with a lesser impact on interstate activities. And so Bruce Church, like this, the fact that it was going to cost him up to $700,000 to add this mark on, and I don't know why that is, but there must have been some real reason. This is how it was such a burden, you know, so such a burden on him and interstate commerce. In those situations, yes, it is unconstitutional under the Dormant Commerce Clause because it does negatively affect interstate commerce. So the Supreme Court, and this is a 1970 case, really had this balancing situation where it looked to whether the law is a fair regulation pursuant to a legitimate state interest or discriminatory against state commerce. So look this word like legitimate state interest, discriminatory against interstate commerce, if it's either of those things. If the law is non-discriminatory, whether the state interest in regulation overrides the adverse effect on commerce. So we'll talk about one case here quickly where this is the situation. So basically looking to, is there a legitimate state interest? And you might argue that there is here. You might argue Arizona should be able to promote its Arizonian products or something, right? But then, is it discriminatory to interstate commerce? You know, it might be. If he's going to do this in order to bring these things to California, maybe it is. If it's not discriminatory, though, does the state interest override the adverse effect? And in this case, they found that it did. So, and if you do have that balance, can the court appropriately weigh non-legal factors like it's really intense financial information or whatever? Can the court even decide about that? That's almost like a third factor that the court looks to. If it feels as though it can't decide to it, it might be a political question. The courts don't handle political questions, or it may be better. I don't know, maybe better left to something else. The court usually tries to pick cases. Remember, the Supreme Court decides which cases it hears. It doesn't hear all cases by far. It hears a small amount of the cases which are granted, small amount of those cases are granted cert, certiorari in order to get to the Supreme Court. And it generally brings up only cases which you can hear. So Maine versus Taylor, you see the pendulum swing the other way. And I've put this in here as I think the last case that I've got for you today before we head over to the computer lab, because I want to show you this kind of brief format. And so this is a LexisNexis example brief. Might come up here. We're in the state of Maine, the great state of Maine. You guys know anything about Maine? Do you know Maine has 16 counties? Cumberland, Franklin, Piscataqua, Somerset, great state. Most toothpicks, creates the most toothpicks in the country. State. Lobsters is a big thing in Maine. You got the defendant and fish. You got a defendant operating, the defendant in this case would be Taylor, Mr. Taylor, operating a bait business. Despite the state statute prohibiting the importation of live bait fish, Mr. Taylor decided to have bait delivered to him from outside his state. Maybe some bait from New Hampshire, bait from Vermont, Massachusetts or something. The shipment was intercepted and Taylor was indicted under one of the Lacey Act amendments. The trial court convicted him, but on appeal, the Court of Appeals of the First Circuit reversed his conviction on the ground of the state statute and permissively restricted interstate trade. And so it went up to the United States Supreme Court. So again, we got this guy. State of Maine has a statute, a law saying no live bait fish or regulating live bait fish. Okay? And why do you think he has that statute? Why do you think he doesn't want people to bring in live bait fish? Right? Exactly. That's exactly what. She said parasites. Exactly. Parasites and other things that can get into its water system and infect its own fish. Right? State of Maine, see parasites. They don't want to bring it in. Just like you see here when you go to the doctor or whatever, it says like, you know, drain your bolt plug and look for algae or other stuff because we don't want that to move around. Okay. So this issue goes before the U.S. Supreme Court. Did the state of Maine, did this state statute impermissibly restrict interstate trade? And interestingly enough, it didn't. It didn't. And it didn't, you're right, it didn't because the Supreme Court looks at that balancing test. Okay? And it looks at like, yes, it is. So yeah, this, you know, stopping this guy from bringing in something from another state, you know, that sounds like a Massachusetts case, right? That's before the Massachusetts case, but there were other cases like Massachusetts for that too. So, you know, yes, there is an interstate commerce thing going on here, right? Buying bait out of St. Britain, can't do it. That doesn't sound good. It doesn't sound good under the Commerce Clause. But the state of Maine was able to show that there were no alternative means to promote that purpose, and that purpose of protecting its own fish population was so important. And there was no other way they could do it. And they needed to do it this way. And so that went on the balancing test. And the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Maine and said, look, if you have a regulation which might impact commerce, but it's so necessary, you know, based on these reasons, then it might be permissible. It serves a legitimate local purpose, strongly legitimate purpose. And the balancing test weighs in favor of state of Maine's ability to protect the animals within its state. Okay, so that throws us for a little bit of a curveball than some of the stuff we've heard before, right? Because that's a lot different than like wheat or something like that. But we got to look to our legitimate state interest thing and that balancing, balancing how much does this affect one place or another place, etc. And so we are in a sort of more modern approach at looking at the balancing test. And like we heard at the beginning of class today, a lot of this is done on a case by case basis, which is surprising. I mean, you can kind of extrapolate or make logical jumps from cases that the courts had heard before. But sometimes, you get this case like Maine brings 1986, where it's actually found to be legitimate. So yeah, there was a previous case when I think this is actually a case in your homework today, City of Philadelphia versus New Jersey, where the court had ruled that New Jersey's ban on out-of-state solid waste was facially discriminatory to the state residents, and therefore was overturned. Kind of interesting case. But it allowed, in Maine versus Taylor, allowed states to prohibit the importation of out-of-state goods if the prohibition served a legitimate concern and there were no other way of protecting that interest. Okay, there's no way to do this better. Arizona had a better way to do it, probably, than put Arizona on each cantaloupe. Yeah, so the Justice Black Moon in that case, who wrote the majority opinion, says, yeah, Steve Lachey, look at that, parasites right there. I don't know how you, that was pretty good. Good get. Did you know that before?
Yeah.
Oh.
No, not in this case, but it's like common sense.
Okay, but like Candace, I would have never guessed parasites. That was an amazing guess. Yeah, they actually cite parasites. The Supreme Court cites parasites. So I don't know, you're Rain Man today or something to say. That was pretty good. So these legitimate local purposes could not be adequately served by any non-discriminatory alternatives. Just like Candace with the Commerce Clause earlier, like once in a while, you guys just really hit it out of the park. All right, so I'll come back to this brief in a second, but I'll note that there are some exceptions sometimes related to if the state is a market participant. And so what kind of things is the state itself a market participant in? Any ideas? So what kind of things is the state itself? Does the state have its own businesses? Maybe the state might have some agricultural interests, but they're generally privatized. It might have park interests, for example. Yeah, might have state park interests. It might have healthcare interests, right? State might have its own healthcare market. It might engage in healthcare as a state or whatever. So if the state is engaged itself in the market, so for example, it's not just regulating, it's not just saying, you lobster people do this, you know, do this, whatever. If it's actually one of the people that's engaged, there's a little bit of an exception where it's not necessarily subject to the Commerce Clause. Although, like for example, Reeves versus State, South Dakota had preferential treatment of South Dakota residents in its sale of state-produced cement. Okay, the state actually did the cement business in South Dakota, and they were allowed to give preference in-state residents in the purchase of their cement. And this was allowed because the state is actually a business. So that's kind of an exception to this. So we can call it an exception, but we have the balancing test like we saw in the Maine versus Taylor case, where we look to, is this the only way to serve this legitimate interest, the only way? And then in Reeves, we have like this looking to, is the state actually the player? Is it not like an individual state's regulating? And so if the state itself is engaged, there's a little bit of a carve out, although that's kind of a variation on our Gibbons versus Ogden case, because in Gibbons versus Ogden, obviously the state of New York was engaged because they were the ones granting the licenses. But they weren't the parties who were directly affected in the suit, for example. And also they were only doing the regulation. They weren't necessarily actually acting as part of the industry. Hughes versus Alexandria, the Maryland statute constituted an impermissible burden on interstate commerce in violation of the Commerce Clause. The only thing that, it's so basically another situation where the state had an interest. There's a question as to whether it does apply to natural resources or not. So if a state had a natural resources business, like the state was engaged in the marketplace in that way, it's unclear from current law whether or not they would be able to then regulate in such a way that would affect interstate commerce. Because, and it's an interesting thing to look at, especially because natural resources, natural gas, et cetera, are such a big field. So with those quick case overviews, let's go back to our, there it is, our Maine versus Taylor brief here. What we're looking at is a case brief. And a case brief is, I had a student, Candace, who asked for if there were any shorter versions of cases, because these cases are long, right? You get the syllabi in there, you get the opinion, which can be ginormous. You then have occurrences, dissents, and the appendices. And what people do to look at cases quickly is they brief, or in a class like this, when we're doing older cases, the way people take notes sometimes, they think case brief. And did you create case briefs before? Okay, so you're ahead of the game. You ever created a case brief? It's okay. You take a lot of notes. You take a lot of notes, and this is kind of a way. It's effectively just a way that people form notes all together, and it allows you, if you have a question on a case, and you want to look up that case, it allows you to go, you can maybe look up the brief of that case, which just says everything on one page that you need to know, okay? And that makes it a lot easier than having to go through the entire case. Now, if you were actually going to pull language from the brief, you have to pull language from the case itself, like you're going to cite it. That's like a long way to it. Yep, exactly, like a long story short. So usually, and this is kind of a weird order that like Snipes doesn't it? Usually you start with the facts, okay? This is what happened in the case, but they boil them down to like 2 or 3 sentences. Maybe here. Do you like a paragraph report? Yeah, I did. A paragraph or two. So it can be longer. It depends. But you do facts and you have your procedure. Yeah, procedure. What's your procedure? Yep, your history, this court, how do they move? Yeah, this court, like, Perfect. And you've got your main issue. Now, your issue in a case is like, what is that case seeking to define? And the issue is most clear when you get to like Supreme Court cases. Because in order for a case to get to the Supreme Court, there needs to be an issue which isn't clear in law already. Where there's some question to in law, like we see in all these cases. And so you have a question of law, and there's a main thing that the court is looking to decide by deciding that case. All right. In Maine versus Taylor, it was, did the state statute impermissibly restrict trade? And that's kind of a short issue statement. You could make it a little bit longer. You could make it a little bit more defined. You could say, did a state statute prohibiting the bringing in of out-of-state, potentially harmful environmental materials restrict, interstate trade in a way that was against the commerce, right? You could kind of like that issue and make it more defined, and that might be more helpful. Like this is a pretty general issue. This likes to separate them. I believe in putting sort of the answers and rules together. You'll see that in some of the examples today. But you can kind of just say after that, no, and then there's a rule. This is what the court decides. This is the opinion. Usually in the court's opinion, the written opinion, this is what is, the rule is usually said in the beginning and it's said in the end. And it might be said in the body paragraphs too. But that's the main thing that's coming out of the court. If they're gonna rule in a particular way. And so in this case, it'd be, the court said, no, once a state law is shown to discriminate against interstate commerce, either on its face, facially they call it, or in its practical effect, the burden falls on the state to demonstrate that both the statute serves a legitimate local purpose and that this purpose could not have been served as well by any non-discriminatory means. Okay.
Well, the only reason why I brought up the full short version was when I started reading Gibbons and Ogden, I did not know the jargon of it. That's what you're telling me.
Especially because it's just old English.
That's right. So,
Yeah.
I was
Well,
like, I can't,
Well,
I just-
yeah, you can, that's not, to some extent, having, especially those old cases, it's just not useful for us anymore, because we can't understand it, And it's not like it's you who can't, it's anyone in law school can't understand those old cases, And so really, this is how they do it. They go through and brief these cases and just go through line by line and try to figure out what, but it's like a long process. If you're not gonna go into law, you're gonna go to business, and you just need to know law on occasion. It's much better to just have the brief. You can just be like, okay, this is what the rule is, and that's right.
I like to.
You like it well.
Yeah, it's like a stressful thing to do, like memorize it, but in your own words. And like when you get an issue, you have to like make the question of yourself.
Shay, it's your lucky day, because you know what we're doing.
Are we doing it?
Oh, no, I just want. You asked for it, so.
Thank you.
No, so actually we will make our way over to the computer lab and we're gonna look at putting together some initial case briefs. And this is just a good skill. So for all of you watching at home, we are moving to the computer lab and we're gonna open up our quiz. So open up your quiz at home. There's an example at the top of your quiz of the different parts of the case brief to include. You don't have to include the procedural posture. Go ahead and just give a sentence or two for each of those, all right? This doesn't need to be a big, long case brief, but I'll see you later.